Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and today we have another lesson from cEDH. cEDH is a metagame within the Commander format that sits at one extreme, with highly consistent, highly efficient decks. Not all cards are equally powerful in all formats, or even in all metagames, but there are lessons to be learned from how players are using some of the most powerful cards in Magic's history. And if you saw our last episode, we talked about the work of some Magic pros like Frank Karsten and Reed Duke, and we're going to try to apply another of Frank Karsten's articles as we continue to improve how we build our own mana bases. And if you want to improve your mana base with any of the cards I mentioned in this episode, be sure to check out our sponsors, FusionGamingOnline.com. They're your source for all your gaming needs. Whether you are just tuning up your mana base, or you have an entire new deck that you want to build with some sweet new cards from one of the new sets, I do believe that Ryan from Commander Cookout is very interested in the next upcoming standard set Aether Drift because he's working on another new vehicles deck. If there's any of the new cards you're looking for from any of the new sets or any of the countless cards released over the past year or throughout Magic history, be sure to check out FusionGamingOnline.com, and you can use the promo code on the screen and down in the description to save yourself a little bit of extra money. That's FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. And of course, Gemstone Mine is part of Commander Cookout Media Group. If you're enjoying this, make sure you check out some of the other content that's on the channel too. You've got the original Commander Cookout that started it all with Ryan and Brando. You've got Ryan's solo project in CADPOP. You have Commander History with Mac and Ryan. You have Commander Munchies, the quickest way to get some of Magic's lore, and you've got both Sidewalk Slam and Curbside Pickups. Not one, but two options for Commander gameplay. Be sure to check it all out. And we're going to get right to this week's topic because there is a lot to cover. If you caught our episode previously about how many lands to include in your deck, I mentioned that Frank Karsten included an entire article in 2022 about how many sources you need to run to actually fix your mana correctly in order to be able to cast your spells on curve. Now remember, fixing is different than ramp. Ramping is specifically referring to the total amount of mana that you can tap for on any given turn. So Mind Stone is a ramp spell. You spend 2 mana on turn 2, so that way on turn 3 after your land drop you untap with 4 mana. Fixing, on the other hand, cares about having the correct types of mana to successfully cast your spells. So while both Mind Stone and Arcane Signet provide a similar amount of ramp for a similar amount of mana, Arcane Signet provides better fixing, because it also provides you with a colored mana source, usually multiple colors of mana in a single package. The deck that I'm going to refer to throughout this week's episode is going to be down in the description, and I'm looking at a 3-color deck in order to really talk more about fixing. Personally, I'm somebody who usually brews in monocolor or in 2 colors. So 3 colors is kind of pushing my comfort level in terms of decks that I'm used to building and used to brewing. I wanted to take this as an opportunity to try to expand my horizons and learn a little bit more about how to build a better mana base. If you've been around the Commander community for a while, you may have heard players talking about spells that are good, but they're just too hard to include. They're a little bit too greedy or too mana intensive. Cards like Unnatural Growth or Grave Pact. Taking Grave Pact as a good example, that powerful enchantment costs 1 black, black, black. That means if I want to be able to consistently cast it on turn 4, I need to be able to produce at least 3 black mana. If I'm only on basics, that means I will need to have drawn and been able to play 3 swamps on turn 4, which means that my land drops on the first 3 turns of the game are probably basically spoken for. If I was anticipating needing to be able to cast cards that were red and green before I cast that big black spell, it would be fairly difficult for me to be able to do so. On the other hand, if my turn 4 value play was a 4 mana value repeatable removal effect like Magus of the Abyss, which costs only 3 and a black, as long as I've drawn a single black source, such as a swamp, I can cast that card on curve with any other land that I've already played. This applies to multicolored spells as well, including our commanders. So if casting our commander on curve is an important part of our game plan, we should be very conscientious about how we build our mana bases. Going old school for just a moment, let's assume that our commander is Zira Arian. This is a 3-mana value commander that costs specifically black, red, and green. Also has an activated ability that costs black, red, and green and tap to have target player draw a card. We're not actually building around this commander, but I wanted to highlight her because she has a very intensive mana cost. If we plan to lean on Zira as a draw engine, we want to cast her right away on turn 3, so we untap with her on turn 4, which means on turn 3, we need to be able to produce exactly black, red, green, which means that if we have all basics, we have to be able to have at least 1 swamp, 1 forest, and 1 mountain. Now, how likely are we to be able to get that in any particular game? That is the question that Frank Karsten sought to answer in the update to his article from 2022. This article focused on having enough sources of different mana types in order to reliably cast your spells on curve. He tries to define a near certainty, usually about greater than 90%, that we will be able to cast our cards on curve, with the percent chance being equal to specifically 89 plus the card's mana value in percent. So, a 90% chance to cast our 1-drops on turn 1, 91% chance to cast our 2-drops on turn 2, and so on and so forth. Karsten argues that more expensive cards coming down on curve is a much more important criteria to meet, because these higher mana value spells have a much greater impact on the course of the game overall. So while getting your 1-drop online on turn 1 is useful, hitting your 5-drop on turn 5 before the game completely gets away from you is absolutely critical. So what is a mana source as defined by Frank Karsten? Let's start out simple. A land is almost always a mana source. A basic land is a mana source for the color it produces. So a swamp counts as a single black mana source. A forest is a single green mana source. A mountain is a single red mana source. This is all pretty basic. Expanding a little bit, dual lands count as a single source of each color it can produce. So, on a single card, Overgrown Tomb, which can tap for black and green, is a single black source and a single green source. This obviously applies to other cycles of lands that tap for 2 colors. So, your Battle Bond lands, your Pain lands, your Surveil lands, your ABUR duels. Lands that consistently tap for all of your colors like Command Tower, City of Brass, and Mana Confluence count as a single source for each of your colors. Overall, though, this is all pretty self-explanatory so far. Some of the edge cases get a little bit trickier. For example, how do you count fetch lands? Karsten argues that a single fetch land should be able to count as a full source for each color it can fetch, which we noted in an episode last year, when combined with typed dual lands, like, for example, Shock lands or ABUR duels, allows even an option like Marsh Flats in a Jund deck to be capable of fetching both Blood Crypt and Overgrown Tomb for black-red or green-black. Or even if you're just looking for a second source, you could grab a basic if you needed to. Or if you have the luxury of just letting it come into play untapped because you're getting it at the end of somebody else's turn, you could fix your lands completely with a Triome like Xayator's Proving Ground, or grab a Surveil land to get a little bit of extra value. Some decks which have a colorless subtheme need to worry about their ability to produce specifically colorless mana. So, for example, Pain lands may be a priority in an Eldrazi themed deck. But most decks don't really care about colorless so much. It's usually more of a downside. Non-land sources of mana are where it gets even trickier, because you have to have the requirements to both cast the spells that provide you with that mana, in addition to having the correct types of mana on them when you draw them. So the reliability of having them on board when you need them goes down a little bit. Further, in most cases, your opponents have the ability to interact with your spells and interact with your permanents in play. So if you cast your Mana Dorks on turn 1, they may decide to just bolt the bird and not let you keep it. Karsten's rule of thumb is that ramp spells like Rampant Growth and mana rocks like Arcane Signet are probably worth about 3/4 of a source of each color they can produce. So in our hypothetical Jund deck, an Arcane Signet is worth 3/4 of a black, 3/4 of a red, and 3/4 of green. Likewise, Nature's Lore can go and grab Overgrown Tomb or Stomping Grounds, so it's worth the same 3/4 black, 3/4 red, 3/4 green. Mana dorks like Birds of Paradise die easily enough that Karsten rates them as being worth about half a source of each color they can produce. So Birds of Paradise is worth half a green, half a black, half a red. And he rates one-shot sources like treasures as about a quarter of a source, as they are always tempting to just crack for mana, so they're less likely to actually be there on the turn that you need them. Finally, he rates cheap draw spells as being worth a fraction of the source equal to roughly the percentage of your deck that is made up of lands that can act as that source of colored mana. And you can see how complex the calculations can get very quickly. But we should take a moment, since we're talking about Commander, to emphasize that in Commander, we really do have nearly perfect fixing on our mana bases. We have fetches plus shocks. Let's assemble our theoretical land base for our Jund deck. Our shock lands are going to give us Overgrown Tomb, Blood Crypt, and Stomping Ground, which can all be fetched by 9 different possible fetch lands, and the only one we can't fetch one of our land types with is Flooded Strand. This basically finishes a full third of our mana base, most likely. That gives us 11 black sources, 11 red sources, and 11 green sources out of 12 land slots. If we decide to be ballers and run the ABUR duels, these 15 lands get us 13 sources of each color. Add in the Battle Bond lands for 18 lands with 15 sources of each color. Pain lands get us to 21 lands with 17 sources of each color. Then let's add in our Rainbow lands. Just start with Command Tower, City of Brass, and Mana Confluence for 24 lands that provide 20 sources of each color. Now, Karsten recommends 41 lands as our starting point, so let's go with 6 swamps, 6 forests, and 5 mountains. I expect we're going to need a little bit more black and green mana when this deck is done. That gives us a 41 land base with 26 black sources, 26 green sources, and 25 red sources. This lets us play some really greedy mana costs according to Karsten. But the reality of modern Commander is that there are very few cards which actively punish you for playing non-basic lands. And cards like Blood Moon, Harbinger of the Seas, and Root Maze see play in a vanishingly small number of decks. The reality is that you want to mostly have a number of basics in your deck just as a consolation prize in case something gets removed with Assassin's Trophy or Path to Exile, not because Blood Moon is a card you expect to see regularly in pods. So instead of playing 17 basics, let's squeeze in some more value. Let's cut 3 basics down to 14 and run the 3 Surveil lands that we can get. Remember, we can fetch these during our opponent's end step, or getting around that whole enters tapped restriction, which means we keep our 41 lands, but also go up to 27 black sources, 27 green sources, and 26 red sources. Let's go further. Cut one of the basics for a Triumph and replace them with 2 basics with 3 MDFCs. Remember that these are worth about 0.7 lands each, and Karsten ranks them as being worth about 3/4 of a source of their color. That gives us 39 lands and 3 MDFCs, with a total of 27.75 black sources, 27.75 green sources, and 26.75 red sources. Which means we cross the threshold to reliably cast black and green spells on turn 3 with 2 colored pips and their mana cost very reliably. But since we're touching green, let's run some of those dorks. Birds of Paradise, Ignoble Hierarch, and Elves of Deep Shadow, each worth about half of a mana source and each worth about 0.28 of a land. So let's cut another swamp, bringing us up to 38 lands, 3 MDFCs, 3 dorks, for 28.25 black sources, 29.25 green sources, and 28.25 red sources. Now our deck is starting to converge on the land counts which we're familiar with in Commander, while still respecting the needs of our colored mana, and being able to reliably cast those 2-pip 3 mana value spells consistently. But is it enough? The TLDR of Karsten's article is summarized in this easy-to-read table. Oof, okay, maybe not easy to read, but I'm going to try to break it down a bit. The vertical y-axis is the number of colored mana sources in your deck, while the horizontal x-axis describes a generic form of mana costs, where C stands in for a colored mana symbol. So Llanowar Elves, Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, and Brainstorm all cost C, while Rampant Growth and Abrade cost 1 and a C, and Dauthi Voidwalker costs CC. This means that the table is roughly grouped in chunks according to the mana value from left to right, with increasing colored mana requirements as you go from left to right within each mana value. Remember that Karsten is aiming for a probability greater than the spell's mana value plus 89%. So he wants at least 90% chance to cast his 1-drop on curve, at least a 91% chance to cast his 2-drop, and so on. And if you're looking closely at this, you may notice that the most dramatic drop is not from one mana value to the next, but with the increase in the number of colored mana pips within a single chunk of mana values. Let's look at our earlier example of Magus of the Abyss as compared to Gravepact, which is 3 and a C compared to 1 CCC. Karsten notes we need only 16 black sources to consistently cast Magus on curve, while we need 33 sources of black mana to reliably cast Gravepact, more than double what Magus requires. This is one of the reasons why we try to avoid those more greedy mana costs in a lot of decks, especially as we're trying to tune them up in power. While something like Gravepact is a very powerful effect, if it gets stranded in your hand, it's just a dead draw. May as well have been a card that has nothing printed on it. Yes, we do have really good mana in Commander, but a lot of times that little bit of efficiency can come from shaving out a powerful effect for a card that you can more reliably cast and get action out of. I want to take a moment too to describe how Karsten accounts for multicolored spells, because in a format like Commander, most of our commanders are going to be multicolored spells. Let's use our theoretical buggy girl, Xeria Arian again. Black, red, green does not appear on Karsten's table, so Karsten recommends to break the cost down. We have black and 2, red and 2, green and 2, which means at least 18 of each of those sources will be needed, and then to use the final CCC for black, red, green as a cost to estimate the total number of sources you'll need that can tap for one or more of black or red or green. Karsten also gives the rule of thumb to just go ahead and increase your total sources by 1 when dealing with gold cards, so bump it up to 19 of each source and then from 36 to 37 for the total number of colored sources we will need to cast this card with 3 colors consistently on turn 3. Now, the deck that I built for this week has Tevesh Szat, Doom of Fools, and Tana the Bloodsower in the command zone. Comparing Tevesh Szat, which is the more important of the two commanders for the deck's game plan, to Xeria Arian illustrates just how demanding those extra colored mana pips can be. And to be able to reliably cast Zarya on turn 3, remember, we need 19 of a green, 19 of a black, and 19 of red mana sources, in addition to 37 total sources that tap for at least one of those colors. Tevesh Szat, on the other hand, 15 black sources, easy peasy to cast on turn 5. So let's compare the super budget mana base of 12 of each basic plus a command tower, 13 sources of black, 13 sources of red, and 13 sources of green. You can get this on the floor of your local game store. The chance to cast Xeria Arian on curve with this type of mana base, 15.9%, less than 1 in every 5 games. Whereas even with our very budget mana base, we're still reliably casting Tevesh Szat on turn 5 91% of the time. This is below the threshold that Karsten actually aims for in his articles, but that is a massive difference between the two. You can't, however, rely entirely on the tables that Karsten presents in his article to build your mana base for you. I built this list this week with Tevesh Szat, and obviously, if we're going for Jund, the partner is Tana the Bloodsower. Link is down in the description. When I analyzed the number of lands I needed, I wound up building in a little bit of a buffer, an extra land or two, just so I had the ability to play multiple lands a turn off of something like Exploration, because someone who has drawn a lot of cards, you're often going to get stuck with a lot of lands in hand, and Tevesh Szat draws a lot of cards. I was also trying to be conscious of the fact that I wanted to fully exploit every single creature that I cast on the battlefield, because it's all well and good when that Elves of Deep Shadow helps me get Tevesh Szat out a turn earlier, but it's even better when I can then immediately sacrifice that tapped Elves of Deep Shadow to draw 2 extra cards. This means that if I wanted to be able to reliably curve out into the late game, I wanted to reliably hit my land drops. So for that reason, I skewed a little bit higher than Karsten's mana analysis would have indicated. I also chose to include more green sources than Karsten's math may have suggested, both as support casting spells that cost 1 green, like Enduring Vitality, which would allow me to turn all the tokens my deck generated into Birds of Paradise. but also to more consistently enable those turn 1 mana dorks which needed green mana like Elves of Deep Shadow, Birds of Paradise, or Ignoble Hierarch. This would allow me to more consistently ramp into an early Tevesh Zot, and to be more likely to have a tapped and expendable body on turn 4 to sacrifice a Tevesh Zot to draw some cards. I also wanted a few more red sources than the deck may have suggested, in order to get out of turn 1 Ragavan or Goldhound, to provide some early treasure sources, while also getting another way to cast Wild Cantor thanks to that hybrid rural mana symbol. This meant the deck could mulligan a lot more comfortably to be able to reach its game plan and live up to its title of inevitability. It also meant that I had to bite the bullet, and I cut Grave Pact from the list, which should normally be a shoo-in for aristocrat-style decks like this. But frankly, needing to boost up to 33 black sources to consistently cast it on curve, have it battle for a spot with something like Tevesh Zot or my other commander Tana the Bloodsower, and for it to be a card type that would be very difficult for this deck to constantly recur and abuse, that was a lot of strikes against it to justify including it in the list. I think, at the end of the day, it was a better choice to replace it with a humble Manglehorn, a card that could come into play, destroy an artifact, temporarily make my opponent's artifacts worse, and then be able to sacrifice Tevesh Zot to draw some cards. It's a small optimization to be sure, and probably wouldn't have been relevant all that often. Most games, I'd probably rather save Grave Pact till after I'd got Tevesh Zot or some other sack outlet out, and then start dominating the board, but I think in most games I'd rather have an expendable body that can take out a problematic artifact, slow down the treasure player, and then be recycled for additional card draw and removal as the game went on. So does this mean that we should cut all of our color-intensive spells from all of our decks? Is Craterhoof Behemoth a bad card? Is Necropotence a bad card? Of course not. But it does mean that when we're building our decks, we should be conscientious about how we're going to include color-intensive spells and which lands we're going to choose to include, as well as realizing when our deck's mana bases are not living up to the rest of our deck's needs. That means we may have to make the tough decisions to cut utility lands like War Room, Urza's Saga, and Emergence Zone, which only tap for colorless mana if we want to be confident about casting spells in our 3 to 5 color decks. I applied these principles when building my Tevesh Tana list, again linked down in the description. I also decided that I should cut back on the MDFC lands I was including and just run real lands instead. Sure, it would have been nice to have an extra body like Disciple of Freylace late game to draw a card and then beat Tevesh Zot, but I think I would have rather had a land that tapped for both black and green to make the deck that much more consistent. You can't have everything you want in just 99 slots, or I guess 98 since I'm running partners. You need to make the tough decisions, and one of the factors you need to take into account is how you're going to achieve your fixing. So how are you going to achieve your fixing? Are you stumbling on mana and your colors in any of your decks? Let us know about it down in the comments. On YouTube, we're part of Commander Cookout Media Group. You can also find us on Blue Sky, where we're at GemstoneMineMTG, and you can send us an email, gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.